Hi, hello, my name is Ollie Bliss and this is my channel Book Drawer. For those who don't know, I enjoy looking at queer fiction and occasionally I create images about it. Today though, I'm doing a vlog style broadcast because I am in Bradford for Bradford Literature Festival, and I've kick-started the day by attending How Queer Are You, which is a panel of 3 different speakers. So there was Claire Heuchan, who has written a book called What is Race? Who are the Racists? Why does skin colour matter? And Other Big Questions, which was a co-produced book with Nikesh Shukla, but he wasn't there. And then other panel members included Dibyesh, Anand and C Sharp, who is a poet, and Paul Burston chaired it, who's written several books and likes talking about Polari. I really enjoyed the conversation that they were having collectively. I thought it was actually a bit more progressive in terms of some of the conversations that I've listened to in the past. They all came with a clear sense of their own identities, and they were actually quite different to each other, and they had a very different understanding or claiming of the word queer, which I thought was really interesting in terms of how they see queer identity sitting with them, and how, because Claire actually rejects it and prefers using the words black, lesbian, female over being assimilated into queer, and her reasoning was really interesting as well, like in terms of it was quite political, which I thought was actually quite useful to have as a counterpoint to other people. And because Dibyesh was really interesting in terms of saying that his identity is with queer, which he prefers over the use of gay, because it's almost going like a step too far for himself, and whereas C Sharp is non-gender binary, and their identity feels like they don't fit in other places, but is actually in a relationship with a man, so feels like their identity is erased for just being a cisgendered woman in a straight relationship. But they're like, that's not me, that's not my identity. It's really not. My identity is more complex than that. So it was brilliant to hear those range of voices in the same space, and how they were talking about the role of colonialism and acts of violence in terms of language that is used, and how people try and push themselves on others and tell them what they shouldn't define themselves in certain ways. And there was talks about negotiations of space, and how you position yourself in space, and how we might need to be uncompromising in certain spaces. And they lent into things like UKIP being present in Pride events. And because I've previously spoke about when I had a conversation in Bristol about the role of police in Pride, it drew back to my thinking around that, and how do you have an inclusive space if you have people who are hostile or resistant to that space, or they are willing to be allied in certain parts of that space but not all of them. So that's something that which I'm still grappling with, I think, but it's all about kind of challenging normalization, which I just thought was great. So brilliant first kind of series of out of the talks which I'm going to see today. Anyway, I will catch you later. Bye. Hello! So I have just seen my second discussion, which was just a single presenter called Anthony Peake, and he was talking all about the mysticisms of J.P. Priestley, who I have not come across before, and this was a kind of like in between spontaneous purchase between the other stuff that I'm seeing, but it has it talks a lot about kind of Jungian based theory and different concepts about the synchronicities of the consciousness and how that relates to identity and kind of philosophy and meaning on a kind of much grander, holistic level. So I wasn't quite ready for the journey that I ended with them, but he was describing how there has been various different events which demonstrates an element of coincidence, but instead of using the word something that happens coincidentally, it's more about a synchronicity of time in terms of time lapses that people experience and then become aware of in different situations, and also where you are actually becoming more in sync with other people. So that was really, I don't know, massively interesting, quite kind of speculative, and I don't know, like you take it with a pinch of salt in terms of, do I subscribe to this, do I believe in this? And I was like, yes, but it's kind of exciting and interesting and nice to think on that level. Could that be a possibility? And it was really interesting to consider things like in popular culture with The Matrix and Interstellar. They are two films which kind of deal with these concepts of time. And I also thought of Arrival, where it's talking about kind of circular time that we have or live in, and it's actually nested in something, and there is a wider consciousness that can basically tap into that overall. And that sounds like super science fiction, but there is something nice in wondering what we are contributing to on a larger, more meaningful level. So those are the types of things which I can kind of just like support and encourage, because I think that's a lovely dream if that could be what we are contributing towards, because I think that's kind of cool. And I think stories like Cloud Atlas tap into some of that type of narrative as well, and it was really nice that it was touching on how there is artists in different time periods who respond to these themes in different ways, and I think there's something really magical about that. So I thought it was cool.
Bennett. Was Bennett? Yeah, they were watching the film. Alan Bennett and his partner. Was that what it? Yes.
Okay, wow. So Jeanette Winterson was so interesting. She definitely had a presence of someone who had experience of preaching, but in a way which was just so genuine and lovely, and coming from a place of non-judgment and exploration and just imagining in a really kind of creative, philosophical, and in some ways, in some sense, you could say juvenile, but I think that's pejorative when it wasn't. It was more meaningful than that, and it was just kind of saying how we sit in the world and kind of critically kind of looking and going, there are these things which have influenced me or made me kind of alert in different ways. And she went through 10 different books which really struck a chord with her. And it was delightful to see that process and that influence and her really honest response to different books and in different ways. And she went through a real range from the Moomins to Shakespeare and other really critical writers. And she had this real sense of humour and insight, which I thought was really, really lovely. And it was like receiving a really warming, wonderful hug from someone who just kind of goes, it's gonna be okay, and this is how we kind of sit in this world, but also kind of questioning it and inquiring it in a way which is always good, and isn't complacent at all, and also where she's kind of rejected other notions and ideas. And like, just the time passed so quickly, and you're just there going, I love you a little bit, which was really nice. And you could hear how captivated the entire audience was throughout. I mean, there was moments where you couldn't hear a pin drop, but then there were just these really subtle little things which he introduced, and it just made the room kind of either erupt with a nod or a sigh or an acknowledgement in different ways. And it wasn't a kind of cheering celebration of the words, it was more of a deep acceptance of what she was saying and an acknowledgement that people in the room related with that, and that rippled through the room in such a lovely manner. I wish I had done an actual recording of the stuff that she's talking about, because it was very fluid, because it was all around storytelling, and she is a great storyteller. But I saw her in a completely different light. Like, she was so animated and extra and extroverted in some sense, but in a really controlled and measured way. Not superficial at all. But yeah, I was just totally drawn to her, totally inspired by everything that she was saying. And it was all the things which I would kind of endorse or subscribe to. And I was just like, yeah, I love your exploration. I love what you're doing. I think it's very cool. So this has probably been the more meaningful session for me, basically. I really enjoyed it. Hello. So I just attended a final session with Caroline Duffy and Jackie Kay and Jeanette Winterson, and was also complemented with another writer who I'll insert, and the artist who had responded to the poems that had been said by those three different writers. And they were all responding to the Brontë sisters, each taking on an individual sister. So the panel were really interesting because they were talking about the relationship between Heathcliff and Cathy, but it was very much from a kind of political sense, in terms of a power structure sense. And for me personally, that was quite interesting in terms of looking at something which is quite heteronormative. It must have been quite radical at that time, and they were each individually unpicking the relationships with each other's sisters, the things that they were facing, and how they responded to that text. And they did it with such light humour, each of them, and it was really quite like a joyful experience. And it was really interesting in terms of, particularly having just seen Jeanette Winterson's talk, which was very much talking kind of in the same way as that previous guy, what was his name, Anthony, who was looking at the relationship of time and the cyclical elements of time. And Jeanette Winterson had stated how she had responded to a painting which had been written about critically and through a poem, and she was then performing that narrative on a stage to everybody else. So there was almost these like 4 indentations of different times, where you had the original creation of the painting, someone then responding to that painting through writing, and then another person commenting on those 2 people, and her then performing that entire narrative, and us all receiving it. And that was quite something to kind of see that lineage talked about in that way. And that kind of was touched on in this writing in the same way, in terms of talking about who those people were in their time frame, and how their voice was meaningful for the circumstances that they were surrounded by, and how we now relate to that narrative so far forward in the future. It's been a very philosophical day, basically. And what was kind of creepy and kind of like, ooh, this whole kind of synchronization concept which I was talking about before. He said there is a shiver when there is this synchronization. Oh, lovely bells, timely. But yeah, so there's a synchronicity that can occur, and Jackie Kay said she felt a shiver, and she used that language in the space, and she was actually talking about a reaction to a situation which happened through time.
It was the first one I carved.
So why is it that? But that's exactly like the books as well, because she was spooky. She's the first one to finish, and this is the last one to get published. And same now with the stones. I mean, it's giving me a wee shiver. The stone shiver. You get the stone shiver. Shiver factor stone.
Isn't that just, I mean, I don't know. Part of me thinks in a really cynical way, like, oh, it's very easy to latch onto coincidences, and we will always convince ourselves that there is something which is happening for a reason, when actually it's just possibly random. But then part of me kind of goes, is it just random? But it's so speculative, and it's something that you can't evidence. And if you were able to evidence, would that be quite sad, really, that you had finally found meaning and ultimately the end of that exploration of what the meaning of life is, when it should be a continuous unknown pursuit? At least I hope. I think that's a more positive and unknown ending, where it's all just happening, basically. But yeah, like, super existential festival for me this year, really unexpected in a lot of ways. Had an incredible time. Probably should sign off, and I'm sorry, this is probably super ranty, but it has been a fascinating day for me. Anyway, all the best, and I will see you again soon. Okay, bye.